Welcome, wayward travelers, to the Scarlet Tavern, where stories are told in candlelight and truth is chased like spirits in a bottle. The Marine Corps tried to solve the problem of black Marines with a fence and a filing system, separate training, separate units, separate expectations. But the Pacific Theater doesn't care what your paperwork says. On an invasion beach, the line between support and combat isn't a line at all. It's a blur of surf, smoke, ammo crates, and survival. And once the Montford Point Marines step into that world, the Corps can keep pretending right up until reality makes it impossible. In this episode, we'll follow the Montford Point Marines beyond the camp and into the war itself, what they were sent to do, what that work looked like under battlefield conditions, and how segregation began to crack when the military machine needed results more than it required tradition. Then we trace the aftermath, how the push toward integration reshaped the Marine Corps, why Montford Point's story nearly slipped from public memory, and how veterans and advocates fought to preserve it until recognition finally arrived decades later. So, if episode 1 was about the door opening, this episode is about what happened when those Marines walked through it, and the institution realized it couldn't control where they belonged anymore. This is Scarlet Tavern. All right. So, Montford Point Marines, part 2. We're going to wrap this up, talk about them being actually at war in the Pacific. Like we had said before, the Montford Marines became a well-decorated unit within the Marine Corps. One of the highest decorated during this time. And we'll talk about some of those earnings and things like that. We'll talk about some of the Marines that were actually involved there and discuss them because their names need to be told. Absolutely. There was a long point in time where the Montford Marines weren't talked about up until probably 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I've never heard of them, and World War II is fun to study for me.
Yeah, I mean, I always knew that there were segregated African American units. Most of the famous ones, when they do talk about it, it's either Tuskegee Airmen, the most famous, some of the best pilots.
Especially for us being Air Force.
Some of the best pilots that the Army Air Corps ever produced, and some of them would eventually become great pilots in the actual Air Force.
And became great instructors.
And
some of them went on to teach.
I think the only other segregated unit in World War II that I ever heard of was, I forget the actual unit designation, but it was a battalion of tankers attached to Patton's Third Army, which was always odd because Patton himself was fairly a noted racist, but he not
761st.
That's it.
The Black Panthers. That's where the racial group took the name from.
Okay.
Was the Black Panthers. Obviously, they turned it into a race battle between the KKK.
Yeah.
But it came from this. They fought 183 days consecutively.
Yeah, they were one of Patton. Again, it's debated of how racist Patton was. Some say he was no more racist than anybody else from his era. Others say he was pretty bad. Either way, he utilized them a lot.
That's something we might do next year for Black History Month.
Black Panthers?
Yeah, we can. These Black Panthers.
Yes.
These Black Panthers, the 761st Tank Battalion.
Yeah.
Because they trained in Texas at Camp Hood. And do you remember what 2 tanks they mastered?
Yes. So one was the M10 tank destroyer. Wasn't the tank destroyer?
M4 Sherman.
Okay, I knew
and
that.
The M5 Stewart.
Really? I thought the tank destroyer as well. I guess I was wrong.
Those were there too. And they were very good with those.
Surprised they gave. Well, actually, now looking back, I'm not surprised they gave them the Stewart. So
they were the first people to meet the Soviets in Austria.
That must have been a culture shock for the Soviets.
Yeah, where a bunch of black army soldiers sitting on tanks meeting Russians for the first time. So we'll talk about them next year. They're a good one. They have a lot of history.
And then I think we're
And
gonna
actually,
do-
there's a famous person that was part of that unit but did not deploy. Jackie Robinson.
Really?
He was part of that battalion. Obviously, one of the most famous baseball players of all time. He never deployed with them, but he trained with them.
and then-
At that point, he was playing baseball then. So he opted to, instead of deploying with them, he was playing. But yeah, Jackie Robinson was there.
And then we'll probably also touch on talk about the Tuskegee.
Yeah,
Airmen.
we'll do some of this and some of the Tuskegee, since that way we're hitting all of the
Branches.
segregated units in the individual branches. So, but the Montford Marines. So Montford Point was never meant to be an endpoint. It was a production line. Once the Marine Corps decided it would accept black recruits, but only under segregation, the next step was building a system that could move those new Marines where the war needed them without ever letting the institution feel like it was losing control. And that's where the story shifts from training grounds to logistics. Paperwork becomes orders, orders become transport, transport becomes deployment, and deployment becomes the vast grinding, industrial reality of the Pacific War. The transformation is almost immediate. A recruit stops being a man who made it through boot camp and becomes a name on a roster, a unit slot, a piece of a much larger machine. In the Pacific, that machine is everything, because island warfare is a math problem made of distance, fuel, shipping schedules, weather, tides, and supply. You don't just send Marines, you send systems that keep Marines alive. And for the Montford Point Marines, the way they entered that machine tells you a lot about what the Corps believed their place would be.
Logistically, the Pacific was the most challenging because of island hopping, which is essentially what it sounds like. The U.S. military figured out we can't take literally every sandbar the Japanese have planted more than 5 guys on, because it'll be a century before we get to even close to Japan. So they just strategically skipped over certain islands, but that means it's longer logistics, everything. There's a few battles where it was particularly bad logistically for the U.S. Marines and the Army.
Yeah. So one Marine Corps historical account describes black Marines being transported across the country under strict conditions. Crowded, sealed train travel where stops were limited, hygiene was minimal, and discipline was still enforced anyway. The point wasn't comfort. The point was movement and control. Get them from point A to point B efficiently, keep the unit together, keep the schedule intact, and keep the Corps grip on the process. That detail matters because it frames what comes next. These Marines weren't being introduced into the Corps world through the front door. They were being routed through a pipeline, one built to function smoothly and one that made segregation easier to maintain. When people hear Pacific War, they picture foxholes and flamethrowers and famous flag raisings. But the war also runs on depots, dumps, warehouses, loading plants, and supply discipline so intense it might as well be religion. That's the Pacific machine, and the Montford Point Marines were fed into it early. A key early example is the 1st Marine Depot Company. The Marine Corps account notes that this unit reached San Diego on April 5th, 1943, impressed observers with its close order drill, then sailed on April 16th, 1943 for Nomea, New Caledonia, a significant Allied base in the South Pacific.
It's part of a chain of islands that are off the coast of New Guinea. This was a particularly bad. New Guinea was known as the Green Hell.
Yeah.
And
which is where the game comes from. Great game.
Yeah. I believe that setting is in the Amazon, but
it's the same thing.
But that's what
Ben and I have played that game. It's fun.
It is.
It's a great survival game.
What game?
Green Hell.
Green Hell. It's a survival.
You're
horror
basically
game.
you're trying to survive in the deepest part of a rainforest jungle.
Nope,
and dealing with local tribes, and
Also,
it's great.
New Guinea is also one of the last vestiges of the cannibal tribes.
The Guineas.
So, again, we could go on for that, but suffice it to say, this was not, I mean, in terms of sending them somewhere, this was probably one of the worst places you could send them. The Japanese hadn't fully started retreating, but this is where they decided where we're going to make the United States and the Allies, the Australians specifically, we're going to make them pay for every single inch that they have to take from us.
Yeah. Even if you never say another word about combat, that timeline tells you something big. Within months of the Marine Corps beginning to train black recruits, black Marines are already being shipped into the operational bloodstream of the war. And Depot Company isn't a soft assignment. It's a job that determines whether a fighting unit has what it needs when it needs it. Ammo, rations, fuel, replacement parts, tents, medical supplies, everything. In the Pacific, where islands are isolated and resupply can be delayed by weather or enemy action, depot work is not background, it's survival. So, this is the part we want to make vivid because it explains why the Montford Point Marines' contributions matter long before anyone pinned medals or wrote speeches. The Pacific supply system is a chain with 100 links. Mainland depots load cargo ships. Ships deliver to major staging hubs. Hubs push forward to island bases. Island bases push supplies to beaches, airfields, and frontline units. And then everything must be counted, guarded, moved, and moved again. Now add the reality of amphibious warfare. You don't unload at a calm dock, you unload into chaos. Depot and ammunition units work around cargo nets swinging from ship cranes, heavy crates that must be manhandled into smaller landing craft, surf that knocks men off balance and soaks everything, salt air that corrodes equipment, exhaustion that stacks up day after day. And this is where the phrase combat support starts to sound like a polite euphemism. Because in the Pacific, beaches are often contested, dangerous spaces. If you're unloading supplies in the zone where bullets and shrapnel reach, you are in the fight, whether the institution wants to call you that or not.
And like I said before, logistics were just challenging because as much as it was efficient for island hopping, there were drawbacks. In some cases, you had large Japanese islands with major bases, major airfields just completely bypassed. Now that's fine because now you don't have thousands of Marines trying to literally duke it out with thousands of Japanese and losing hundreds of men for essentially nothing. But you now, in the middle of your logistic line, you have a Japanese held island with an air base, and you have to not only somehow move around that, you have to guard it.
Yeah.
Japanese submarines are everywhere. This is... People don't when we think of World War II, we think of the European front, which is pretty standard in terms of warfare. The front line is 5 miles this way. We're here. We will see the Germans or the Italians coming for us. The rear is safe. There are many accounts of Guadalcanal where Henderson Field, even at full operation, people were still getting sniped from Japanese from the jungle.
Yeah.
Even when the whole hills around it were supposed to be, they're up on the other side of the island fighting, yet there's still Japanese riflemen taking pot shots at us. So
the Marine Corps account gives a stark example of how quickly the illusion of separation collapses once these units reach the combat zone. During operations around Saipan, June 1944, depot companies are described moving cargo from ships into landing craft, distributing supplies under fire, dealing with casualties, and in one instance, a squad fighting as infantry to reinforce a thin defensive line near the shore. It's not a detour, it's the point. You can build a segregated pipeline, you can assign men to categories, you can insist they're not combat troops, but the battlefield doesn't accept your categories, it just demands what it demands. And that's kind of why it is now that a Marine is he's a rifleman first, and whatever his job is second.
Yeah.
That is why they train that way, because of this. They tried to keep these people from being riflemen, and they ended up being riflemen anyways, and again became some of the most decorated riflemen to ever exist. And so now the Marines train you as a rifleman, and then it doesn't matter if you go on to be a fucking dentist in the Marine Corps, which you don't because that's the Navy, but it does.
A lawyer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It doesn't, technically that's still Navy too, because that's JAG.
No, they have Marine lawyers.
But you still go through the full combat training. You're doing hand-to-hand combat. You're doing all of that stuff. And then whatever you do after that is whatever. Mm-hmm. You're still a combat Marine.
And just again, some of these battles, Saipan, D-Day of the Pacific, probably one of the most brutal fighting we've had in all of the islands.
Yeah.
First time the United States Marines ever got the first glimpse of the Banzai charge.
So the same Marine Corps account notes that on that Saipan D-Day, Private Kenneth J. Tibbs died of his wounds. He was identified there as the first African-American Marine killed in combat in World War II. Even if you only mention that once, it lands like a truth serum. The war did not keep these Marines safely in the margins. These people in Saipan aren't going, oh, they're black, I'm not going to shoot them.
If anything, the Japanese are going to kill them more because the Japanese were notoriously racist
Yes.
and looked down on anybody who was not Japanese.
So because once Montford Point Marines are overseas, loading ships, unloading beaches, distributing supplies, guarding critical infrastructure, and absorbing casualties, something changes in the logic of segregation. Not morally, not suddenly, but practically. The Corps might still try to define their place narrowly, but the war forces an uncomfortable question. If you're essential to keeping Marines alive in combat zones, if you're moving under fire, taking losses, holding lines when needed, what exactly are you if not part of the fight? And we see that a lot. I've watched some interviews with white Marines that were there at the time, and they talk about how once this, obviously you always had people that were a little bit racist, blah, blah, blah. It's the time. But once that fighting started, there was no black and white.
No.
There was Marines. And
it's survival. You're all just trying to survive.
And it's funny that the big Marine Corps didn't want to integrate, but the boots on the ground were like, we don't give a fuck what color you are as long as you don't get me killed. It's that simple.
Well, the reality is that segregation doesn't work, period. But in a combat setting, it's like, what are you going to do? You're going to have some guy yelling at you like, get over there. You're not supposed to be over there. The blacks are over there. It's like, dude, do you want me to shoot the enemy or do you not want me to shoot the enemy?
Yeah. So, and that's where this episode starts to tighten because now two conflicts are running at the same time. One against the enemy overseas and one inside the American military system that still doesn't know how to treat these men as fully belonging. So, as the Montford Point Marines move into the Pacific Machine, the war begins, as it always does, and it strips away comforting illusions. It reveals who's actually carrying the load, and it punishes anyone who mistakes labels for reality. But alongside the mortar fire and the exhausting work, another battle follows them. Quieter, uglier, and constant. The fight over respect, dignity, and basic treatment from the very institution they're serving. Next, we're going to talk about that second conflict, the war within the war, and what it cost them to fight on two fronts at once. So here's the ugly truth. The Pacific makes it impossible to ignore that segregation didn't stay back home. It packed its bags, boarded the transport, and showed up on the same islands as everybody else. Still armed, still confident, still looking for someone to put in their place. And when you're living in a combat zone, that kind of system gets unstable because war demands efficiency, cooperation, speed, and improvisation. Segregation demands hierarchy, distance, control, and constant enforcement. Those two needs collide over and over until the pressure finds a weak seam. And on Guam in late 1944, that seam ripped open. Guam had been retaken months earlier and was being transformed into a significant American base. Airfields, depots, and the massive logistic footprint needed to keep the Western Pacific campaign moving. Black servicemen attached to supply operations alongside segregated Marine units like the 25th Marine Depot Company were essential to building that engine. But the atmosphere around them wasn't, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. Sorry.
What song is that? Who sings that?
It's from
High School
Musical.
I never saw that.
Well, you were like 30 when it came out.
Fuck you.
It was closer to a stateside Jim Crow town dropped into the tropics. One black Marine would later compare Guam to a city deep down in the South, and he wasn't talking about the weather. What did that look like on the ground? It looked like white servicemen trying to police where black men could go, who they could speak to, and what kind of liberty they were allowed to have, especially when it came to the town of Agana. Today it's Hagatna, and Chamorro women. It looked like intimidation that didn't need official orders. Shouted slurs, rocks thrown, and even smoke grenades tossed from passing trucks into the cantonment area where black sailors were housed at the Naval Supply Depot. Not a battlefield, a harassment campaign. And keep in mind, these are black sailors. The Navy had no problem with integration.
No.
They still had segregated units. Everybody had segregated units, but the Navy were a lot. I mean, it's kind of hard to segregate on a ship or in a sub.
They found a way.
When it's close quarters.
So the Navy was always very interesting when it came to segregation. The only thing they segregated was jobs.
Yeah.
You couldn't be
most of the African Americans in the Navy were cooks.
Yeah, or some kind of a service.
They were cleaning bathrooms. They were doing all that.
Yeah, but the reality is that on a ship, like in everything else,
tight.
Well, it's not just that. You have, from what I understand, you have your regular rating, like electrician, mate, carpenters, mate, whatever the hell it is. But then you also have a battle station.
Yeah.
So often enough, when you could be the messmate, but if your battle station is you are manning that AA gun to shoot down the planes, guess what? The guy feeding you ammunition.
It's probably going to be black.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the Navy and mess hall, do you know who the first African American that got the Navy Cross?
I don't know his name, but I remember he was on the USS West Virginia in Pearl Harbor. He actually shot a plane down.
Yeah. Doris Dory Miller was the first black American to receive a high-level medal in World War II, earning the Navy Cross for his actions during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941.
Yep.
Miller, a Navy mess attendant, bravely manned an anti-aircraft gun despite having no training.
Yep.
Yeah. It kind of, once combat started, the Navy was like, okay, we can't just have a bunch of dudes who are just literally standing around not doing anything.
And wasn't that also in the movie Pearl Harbor?
Yes. Cuba Gooding Jr. did that.
Yep.
I believe that was probably one of the only accurate things from that movie.
Yeah.
Because Ben Affleck should stop making historical dramas because he's bad at them.
Yeah. So once that kind of behavior becomes normal, it escalates because someone always decides normal isn't enough. By mid-December, the situation was bad enough that Guam's provost marshal warned Major General Henry L. Larson that things were getting dangerous. Larson responded with an order meant to tamp it down, explicitly calling for respect across race and origin and warning against discrimination. The problem was timing. This order came after the island had already been soaking in hostility. In reality, he did a good thing, but that should have been the order from the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, he still did a good thing. He didn't say, "Oh, we're going to maintain segregation." He said, "Quit fucking with each other. We're in war."
End of 1944, again, to just put it in perspective of what they're dealing with. Yes, Guam has been taken for months, but now they're starting to look at places like the Philippines. The Philippines are, I believe, are already starting landing there. They're already starting to make plans for Okinawa and Iwo Jima. What would be Okinawa and Iwo Jima? The fighting isn't by late 1944. In Europe, to put it in perspective, the Germans were done. They hadn't figured it out yet. So combat was kind of slowly going down. If anything, it's the opposite. It's ramping up in the Pacific. So the last thing these generals in the Marines need is a bunch of dumb yahoos from whatever division is on Guam harassing the guys in the depot. It's like, just knock it the fuck off. But as we'll see, it was a little too late.
Yeah, so it was October 44 that we landed in the Philippines.
So even more.
And the famous General MacArthur, is the one that landed there.
Yeah. After he abandoned it and
he famously announced his return to the Philippine people. That was a big thing.
Oh my god! I'm sorry. We're not getting on this tangent because we will probably have the future episode of where I will rip MacArthur apart.
Well, because we can talk about the Battle of Lake Gulf.
We could talk about have a whole
because that's the largest naval battle of World War II.
Leyte Gulf. Yeah, there's a bunch of battles.
Because that's where we landed was the Leyte landings.
Yeah.
So, but I won't get into MacArthur, but suffice it to say, there's when generals should not be writing their own press releases and releasing them.
Yeah.
MacArthur's his least favorite general ever.
He
should have stayed in Arkansas.
He should have been left. Roosevelt should have abandoned him in the Philippines. We probably would have all been better off for it.
So then the violence started coming in a chain, each link tightening the next. There were multiple incidents in quick succession. A white military policeman firing at black servicemen in Nagana. They missed. A white sailor shooting and killing a black Marine from the 25th Depot Company in a dispute involving a woman. Of course, me love you long time. And a black sentry from the 27th Marine Depot Company killing a white Marine who had been harassing him. Court-martial would eventually convict the men responsible for fatal shootings of voluntary manslaughter, but eventually is the key word. Justice moves slowly. Rumors move at the speed of oxygen. And rumor is the gasoline in a segregated system. A false version of the story spread among African Americans at the Naval Supply Depot that the black victim had been a sailor killed by a white Marine, and it caught on because it fit the pattern everybody had already been living inside. Some men commandeered trucks and drove into Agana in search of revenge. Military police managed to defuse that first wave before it became something irreversible. But the pressure didn't leave, it just waited for the night. On Christmas night, a larger group described in Marine Corps histories as 43 black sailors armed themselves with knives and clubs and pushed into camp housing white Marines. That's the moment the war within the war becomes undeniable. While the Pacific fight demands unity, the American system on Guam is producing a riot between Americans in uniform. Afterward, the response fell hard on the black servicemen involved. The National Archives Black History Training Summary describes arrests and charges including unlawful assembly and rioting, and notes that 44 black Marines were court-martialed with verdicts later overturned in 1946.
As much as I understand their frustration and being harassed and everything,
you're just feeding the monster.
You really, it's kind of hard to defend it when you literally bust into there with knives and clubs. It's like, dude, I want to help you, but come on.
So there's another detail here that matters for the story. The pushback didn't come only from inside the chain of command. Larson convened a court of inquiry that took testimony for a whole month. And Walter White, not that Walter White.
That's what I said. Like,
he's not making meth.
Are we sure?
Who knows?
I don't think meth was invented at this point.
Then a senior leader in the NAACP was on a fact-finding tour in the Pacific and participated. In the Marine Corps' own historical account, White's work helped establish the broader pattern. The harassment wasn't a few bad apples. It was pervasive, unofficial, and spontaneous, yes, but still relentless and cruel. That matters because it reframes the riot not as some random breakdown of discipline, but as the predictable consequence of a system that required constant humiliation to function.
This is what happens when you recruit from the South.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but at this point in time, you Southerners suck. And that's coming from you. And even as racist as the North could be, and it could be plenty freaking racist, I can tell you that right now, this is just some bullshit.
Yeah. And that's what makes Guam such a pivot point. Because Guam isn't a training-based story. It's not a prove you belong story. It's an operational reality story where black Marines and black sailors are essential to the war machine and yet are still treated as trespassers in the very uniform they're wearing to serve the country. Segregation can survive a lot of hypocrisy. What it struggles to survive is necessity. By the time the calendar turns toward 1945, necessity is about to get brutal. Guam shows the fault line, American racism doesn't pause for war, it just relocates. But in the next phase of the Pacific won't be fought around depots and liberty towns. It'll be fought on the ground so unforgiving that every bullet, every bandage, every crate of ammo must arrive through chaos. And that's where these men, so often pushed to the margins, end up standing at the center of the machine on two islands' names that still hit like a gut punch: Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
I mean, if we could, again, American segregation and their racist policies have just staggeringly made no sense. In England, and I think it was 42 when American forces started regularly setting up in England, there was an instance, and it was either England or Wales, but literally a Caribbean serviceman, and a British man. He was part of the British military, but he was from like Jamaica or Trinidad or something. He was literally walking into a pub with his girlfriend who was white, and he starts getting heckled by American servicemen, and then American MPs tried to drag him out of the pub saying whites only. Like, these MPs were literally going around to pubs and just putting placards on them without the owner's permission, mind you, and saying whites only. And of course, as much as the British had colonial units, they didn't have official segregation. A black British service member could go into whatever store, pub, or wherever he wanted to. Now, that doesn't mean people aren't going to be an asshole to him. Depends on where you are, but there was no official law against it. And U.S. servicemen literally tried to be like, you can't go in there, boy. And he's like, fuck you, man. That's poorly of me. I'm sorry. But
that was Jamaican.
Well, the man was Jamaican. But literally they tried to enforce American segregation laws on the British, and the British were like, get fucked, mate. It literally had to have Eisenhower to come in and tell them to be like, if you want to have segregation, just open your own bar.
Yeah.
And literally that's what they did. You had officers make up their own bars and put whites only. It's like, are you that determined to have Jim Crow everywhere you go?
Apparently.
Jesus.
So by 1945, the Pacific Campaign wasn't just island hopping anymore. It's closing in on Japan itself, and the battles are getting smaller on the map and bigger in human cost. Iwo Jima becomes a volcanic choke point, and Okinawa becomes the doorstep. Iwo Jima is taken for reasons that sound clinical until you attach blood to them. Airfields, bombing routes, emergency landings, and a forward base close enough to matter. Planners expected it to be fast. Instead, it becomes a 5-week grind through tunnels, caves, and kill zones.
So we will probably do an episode on Iwo Jima.
Yeah, I mean,
this is also just a brief spoiler. It's also the place where American casualties outnumber Japanese.
Yeah. On February 19th, 1945, when the Marines hit the island on D-Day, Black Marines were there with them. The Montford Point Marines who land on Iwo are serving in depot and ammunition companies within the 8th Field Depot, assigned to the V Corps' shore party. Huh?
It's 5th Corps.
V Corps, whatever. Two of those Black Marine companies, the 8th Ammunition Company, landed on D-Day itself. Yeah, the Marines don't ever make any sense. Because why would you put an 8 and then you want the 5th to be V?
Yeah, it's Roman numerals.
I understand that, but why is the 8th Field Depot not Roman numerals?
I don't know.
Because they're fucking idiots.
You won't get any
all Marines are stupid.
You won't get any argument from me.
What does Marine stand for?
Oh yes.
Muscles are required, intelligence not expected.
Or non-essential.
Yeah.
The only Marine that's smart is your uncle.
Well, that's because he's not a straight Marine.
No,
yeah, that's
he
right.
Went from the Marines
he went to different branches.
to the Navy and then got out
to the
in Army.
Yeah,
So now shore party can sound like paperwork, forklifts, and a nice quiet pier.
They have forklifts back then?
Yeah.
Manual.
Oh.
Yeah, like the...
yeah, those are called forklifts.
Yeah, pump forklifts. Iwo Jima offers none of that.
Yeah.
The beaches are soft. It's gorgeous now. The beaches are soft, volcanic sand that clings and steals traction. The shelling is steady enough that the shoreline becomes its own kind of front line. The work is brutally simple. Keep unloading, keep moving, keep supplies flowing off landing craft and amphibious vehicles while the island tries to kill you for standing upright. What's striking in the Marine Corps' history account is how the casualties began to stack once the initial somehow we're still alive window closes. A handful of days in, Marines from these companies start getting hit, wounded, and dying of wounds. It's not an abstract risk, it's names and reports, dates and logs, and empty places informations. Then comes the moment that seals what Iwo is as a battle. March 26th, 1945, which we're coming up to the anniversary of.
Mm-hmm.
After the island is officially declared secure, a Japanese force breaks through and attacks the rear and support areas near the western beaches. The shore party gets struck. The fighting is close and violent, and Black Marines are part of the units absorbing it. More are killed or wounded. And here's one of the most telling details. The commander overseeing the shore party in Field Depot later praises the Black Marines' conduct in that surprise fight, emphasizing their security, their composure under fire, even their reluctance to talk up what they'd done afterwards. This is not the language you use for unproven troops. And this is the big thing. So, again, at this point, we believe the island's secure. So, at this point, everybody's like not combat ready, just moving stuff through. Obviously, you still have secure points because you're in war, but everybody's a lot more relaxed. So these Marines would just be taking and moving the stuff, setting up their little bases. Because again, we're setting to go after Japan here.
Yeah.
And so they're getting everything set up, and then boom, out of nowhere, they're getting attacked. And these Black Marines could have fucking ran.
Well,
they could have
yeah,
done.
they could
Well,
have.
think about it. They're supply guys. They're, according to the Marine Corps, they're not combat men.
No.
They could have ducked, and probably at this time, they would have gotten yelled at and made fun of, but they were supply guys.
Yeah.
But instead, they're picking up the rifles. A lot of them are dying, but they were at the front line, tearing apart the Japanese at this point. And when you have, and keep in mind this commander that is overseeing the shore party is white, and he is praising them for what they did, for them being true Marines. And this is where we'll start to see that little turn in some of the places of the war where they're starting to get accepted as Marines, not Black Marines.
They're, I mean, as I said before, in this case, especially the Pacific, there are no such thing as the rear echelon. These guys, they have your official designation, but as we saw here, the Japanese had a tendency to just popped up. I mean,
they had the tunnels and everything. Like they were preparing for years.
And they're little guys.
War.
They're little guys.
Japanese aren't as,
they're little guys.
They're not Pam sized.
Fuck you.
It's average height for Japanese.
But literally, I don't know the specifics of this incident, but in all likelihood, you probably had a decent amount of Japanese who probably just sat there in a cave and waited for the Marines to just go well on past, and they're like, okay, they are out of eyesight. They have gone on to wherever. Let's go bonsai for the Emperor, and that was it.
Yeah. If I remember right, a lot of it was nighttime.
Yeah.
That they were sleeping. They didn't realize they were being watched.
Yeah, I mean,
and the Japanese popped up.
Yeah.
By all accounts, the Japanese were ruthless, and
it took us years afterwards to find all the tunnels. It took so long.
You know what movie we need to watch?
What's that?
Flags of Our Fathers.
Yeah. So, Iwo Jima becomes a pivot point. The Marine Corps can call these men labor troops in administrative shorthand, but Iwo forces a different reality. They're doing essential work on a lethal beach, and when the fight reaches them, they fight. Then comes Okinawa, and everything gets bigger.
Okinawa is just, however bad Iwo Jima was, Iwo Jima is essentially a big volcanic island.
Yeah.
Lots of rocks, lots of craggy rocks in ravines and stuff. And ravines in this, not like you would see like the Grand Canyon or anything, but just it's big and open. But Okinawa, it's a beautiful island now, but it's got jungles, rivers, mountains,
And then at this point, it's got debris
and it's
craters, and
it's also has a Japanese population, because this is the most southern of the Japanese home islands.
Yeah.
This is Japan. This is not an island like this isn't Tarawa or Peleliu. This is home for the Japanese.
Yeah. So, on April 1st, 1945, more than 60,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines stormed ashore. The battle turns into nearly 3 months of brutal ground combat, amplified by rain, mud, rugged terrain, and a defense system anchored around the Shuri lines. At sea, the invasion fleet is hammered by sustained kamikaze attacks, testing nerves and steel in equal measure.
I wonder what asshole thought it would be funny to start this on April Fool's Day.
Yeah.
I just realized it. I don't think I ever realized when this happened. I'm just like, what fucking asshole did this?
Are you looking it up?
No.
But yeah, this is also a big thing. This is when the Japanese really fully unleashed the kamikazes on Allied forces in the Pacific.
Fuck the kamikazes.
I mean, technically speaking, the Japanese have been committing acts of kamikaze, like suicidal charges, throughout the Pacific, but this is where they realize, hey, let's organize them into like units and send them out there.
Yeah.
And these guys took suicide to an art form.
So, this is also where the Montford Point story hits its largest wartime concentration. A Camp Lejeune historical display notes that the fight for Okinawa involved about 2,000 African American Marines, a larger concentration than in any previous operation. And they aren't showing up as a token presence. They're arriving as part of the logistics backbone that must function even when the ground turns to soup and the air keeps screaming. Marine Corps records describe multiple black depot and ammunition companies arriving at Okinawa on D-Day, and in the weeks that followed, feeding the supply system that kept frontline units moving, firing, and surviving. What makes Okinawa especially important for this episode is how it exposes the lie that war can be neatly divided into combat and support. On an island campaign, the work of moving ammunition, evacuating wounded men, and keeping the invasion force supplied becomes inseparable from the fight itself. Some sources emphasize that Black Marines ended up doing dangerous work under fire, including evacuating wounded men in roles they had not been trained for, because reality didn't wait for the institution's comfort. So by the time you reach Okinawa, the arc is unmistakable. Iwo shows Black Marines landing with the invasion and surviving a beach that functions like a killing field. Okinawa shows them present en masse, integrated into the operational machinery at the exact moment the Pacific War becomes its most brutal version of itself. This is the point where on trial stops being a quiet assumption and starts looking ridiculous. Even the commandant, Alexander Vandegrift, is quoted as drawing a firm line in what the war had proven. They're Marines. Period. Wrong there. Should be Theyre. They are Marines. After Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the war moves towards its ending. But the contradiction doesn't dissolve when the shooting stops. The Marine Corps is left holding two truths at once. These men were essential, and the system built to separate them no longer makes sense in the world the war created. Next, we follow what happens when battlefield realities finally force the paperwork to catch up, and what that shift means for the segregated training center that started it all.
And I want to point it out. He's supposed to be editing it.
I missed it. My bad.
Well, this is what happens when you do it last minute.
I know.
Yeah.
At 7 a.m. on the day it's supposed to be recorded.
This one I did long before that.
No, that's the next episode.
Yeah. When the war ends, there's a temptation in American history to tie everything up with a neat ribbon. Victory abroad, progress at home, lesson learned, credits roll. But for the Montford Point Marines, the post-war years were less happy ending and more now prove it counts. The Marine Corps should admire wartime performance and still resist changing the structure that kept Black Marines separate. That's the trap of on paper. Paper can promise equality while the lived system keeps its old habits. Even before the major policy earthquake, some moments signal that the Corps is being slowly pushed into a new reality. One of the most symbolic events happened on November 10th, 1945. Frederick C. Branch was commissioned as a second lieutenant, widely recognized as the first African American Marine officer. That date matters more than trivia. It's the Marine Corps' birthday. A day soaked in tradition, and a Branch stepping into officer ranks makes a quiet statement. The club mindset is taking hits where it used to feel untouchable.
Shouldn't be club, it should be cult.
Yeah. But even here, the on paper theme shows up. A Marine Corps Museum profile notes that because the war had ended, Branch was placed in the Marine Corps Reserve and points out that discrimination didn't just vanish because his rank existed. So, the message of the post war period becomes clear. Progress comes with conditions and caveats. Then comes the formal turning point that finally makes segregation in the armed forces indefensible at the federal level. One of the great things that Truman did.
Truman did a lot of good things.
Oh, he did, but this was a great one.
Yeah.
On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman, a great president,
Give him hell, Harry.
signed Executive Order 9981, declaring a policy of equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, regardless of race, color, religion, or national origin, and establishing a presidential committee to help implement it. And I will say Truman was one of the least racist men that we saw in power at this time.
Oh, yeah. He was very much the one. Well, you got to look at his origins. So, Roosevelt was from a very upper class crust New York family that was very racist.
Yes.
Roosevelt himself was very racist. He didn't show it, believe it or not, but he was very like that. Waspy. Look at these poor little.
Most of those people probably had black slaves working for them.
Or yeah,
Black help.
Yeah. I don't know much about Herbert Hoover, but he was better about racial relations. But Harry Truman himself
fought for black rights.
Harry Truman, I would say before the him and Calvin Coolidge were probably the only two presidents prior to the 1950s who did anything to speak out or do something about African American rights. Everybody else either did nothing or they actively fought against it.
Yeah.
Truman was just an ordinary. He was a shoe salesman from Missouri.
Yeah.
So he very much is all about just being like, hey, I believe in treating everybody equally.
Yeah.
Just fairly.
Small town Midwest man.
Lamar, Missouri.
Yes, he's a small town Midwest man.
That's he fought. He had a lot of pressure because he was half of his. George Marshall, one of his Secretary of State at the time, also a general in World War II, threatened to resign because Harry Truman was going to recognize Israel, and Marshall was very much a kind of an anti-Semite. But Harry, one of Harry Truman's best friends that when he was working as a shoe salesman was Jewish, and he came up to Harry and said, Harry, I've never asked you for a thing in my life, but you got to help my people.
Yeah.
And Harry was the first major nation, the United States was the first major nation under Truman to recognize Israel as a country.
Yeah. So again, Truman passing this executive order was a massive thing. So the phrasing is important because it's both bold and revealing. The order says the policy should be put into effect as rapidly as possible while still accounting for efficiency or morale. That line is a window into how institutional change works. Even when the destination is declared, the timetable is contested. And that's where the Marine Corps enters the next phase of the story, the phase that feels less like a single dramatic moment and more like a slow turning of heavy machinery. Montford Point continued to operate after the war, but once EO 9981 is in play, the logic holding a segregated recruit depot together starts to collapse. Eventually, it doesn't make sense to keep training black recruits separately if the armed forces are ordered to desegregate. The National Archives' unwritten record account draws a straight line here. In response to EO 9981 and the desegregation of the services, Montford Point was decommissioned on September 9th, 1949. Marine Parents adds important operational detail about what that meant in practice. The Marine Corps deactivated Montford Point as a segregated training facility in September 1949. They began sending black recruits to training at Parris Island and San Diego.
Where they
Sucks for them, because Parris Island was worse than what they were dealing with.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was probably like, man, now we get to go. Man, this place sucks.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you all wanted to be with everyone else.
Yeah.
Well, now you got what you wish for.
And then there was the Hollywood Marines.
I
For
don't
those
know.
that don't know, the San Diego, anybody trained at San Diego is called the Hollywood Marines.
Which is interesting because they're nowhere near Hollywood.
No,
I remember
but
right, the
they're
dividing
California.
line between if you went to Parris Island or San Diego was the Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anybody east went to Parris Island.
Anybody west went to San
I
Diego.
think they still kind of do.
They
that.
do it.
Yeah.
They still do it.
Yeah. I mean, if they're
It's their own version of segregation.
yeah. I know
Marines couldn't get past it.
I know the Army used to send you to boot camps throughout the country based on what your MOS are. Now that from what I've seen now being in the Army, it's like, where can we just stick them?
I mean, well, now you've got depending on your MOS, you have the OSIT training, the one station unit training, where you're doing basic and your A school at the same time.
I mean, there's a person in my unit just got there. They're a common person like me. They went to basic training in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I even asked them, it's like, but that's artillery. You're not artillery. And they were like, yeah.
Yeah, well, the Air Force held their ground.
Yeah.
Everybody goes to Lackland.
Yep.
That's it. So it's a massive pivot, and it carries complicated emotional weight. Because Montford Point closing can sound like a simple administrative change, but it actually is two things at once. One, it's a sign of progress, the end of a system designed to keep Black Marines separate. And two, it's also the end of a place that had become a community, a proving ground, and a shared identity for the men who passed through it. Integration ends the need for Montford Point, but it also risks swallowing Montford Point's story. When you dismantle a separate system, you don't just dismantle discrimination. You also dismantle the visible container that made the history easy to point at. Even after EO 9981 and Montford Point's deactivation, implementation doesn't happen at the same speed everywhere. Marine Parents notes that the Marine Corps was slow to carry out integration orders at first and frames the Korean War era as a turning point, stating that the Corps was fully integrated by June 1950.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to implement segregation. It's like, well, it's like, now, legally speaking, you're not supposed to have it. So
Yeah.
you literally is the first time I think they made a movie about it. I don't know the name of it, but you literally had a movie where a black butter bar is now the platoon leader of
An all-white
platoon, and the sergeant is racist.
Yeah.
So yeah, that thing started happening, along with integrated fighter squadrons and things of that nature too.
So here's the lingering truth. Policy can force the door open wider, but institutions still must walk through it. So this lands on a hard-earned conclusion. Segregation officially ended in 1948. Montford Point ended as a segregated recruit depot in 1949, and the Marines moved toward full integration as the next war arrived. And yet, even with those dates, something remains unresolved. Because if a place disappears and the country moves on, what happens to the story of the men who were forged there? Montford Point's deactivation closes one chapter but opens another: memory. Once recruits are integrated into the central depots, Montford Point risks becoming a quiet footnote instead of the turning point it really was. Next, we'll follow how Montford Point Marines and the institutions around them fought to preserve the story, protect the legacy, and eventually push the nation toward formal recognition. When Montford Point ended as a segregated system, something else began: the risk of disappearance. Because once black recruits were sent through the same depots as everyone else, Montford Point could be treated like an awkward footnote, a temporary solution, a closed camp, a chapter you don't have to reread if you'd rather keep the myth of effortless progress intact. So, the men who lived it did what veterans have always done when history starts slipping through the cracks. They organized. In 1965, Montford Point veterans formed what became the National Montford Point Marine Association to preserve the legacy of the first Black Marines and to serve their communities through chapters, outreach, and support programs. That founding matters because it tells you something about the post war decades. Recognition didn't arrive automatically, it had to be built. The way a base is built, the way a unit is built, the way a tradition is built, brick by brick, meeting by meeting, story by story. And the association's mission isn't only historical, it's also practical, keeping the legacy visible through education and community work, and making sure the men who carried that burden aren't treated like the ghosts while they're still alive. Memory also gets anchored to place, and Montford Points didn't vanish even when the segregated mission ended. In 1974, Montford Point was renamed Camp Johnson in honor of Sergeant Gilbert Hashmark Johnson. He's one of the most iconic figures from Montford Point. The renaming is a quiet form of memorialization. It takes a location that could have been paved over in the public mind and stamps it with a name that forces a question. Who was Johnson? Why does this place matter? Then the legacy becomes something you can walk into. The National Montford Point Museum exists to collect, preserve, and display artifacts and records tied to the Montford Point Marines, with the stated goal of public education. The association describes it as holding a significant collection of photographs and documents that capture the 1942 to 1949 experience. That museum isn't just a nice to have. It's a counterweight to amnesia. It's a physical answer to the kind of dismissal Montford Pointers faced for decades. Where's the proof? Where's the record? The museum says it's here, in the uniforms, the papers, the photos, and the names. And beyond the Marine Corps world, the story becomes part of America's broader historical record. Institutions like the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture include Montford Point alongside other World War II era barrier breakers, placing them where they belong, inside the national narrative, not beside it. Even with associations and museums, national recognition can still lag for generations. For Montford Point, the most visible "we see you" moment arrives decades late, but it comes in one of the country's highest symbolic honors. In Public Law 112-59, signed November 23, 2011, Congress authorized a Congressional Gold Medal to honor the Montford Point Marines collectively. Then, on June 27, 2012, the Congressional Gold Medal was presented collectively to the Montford Point Marines in a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. The U.S. Mint...
It was for 13,000
Yep.
Montford Point Marines.
The U.S. Mint's release around that presentation also underscores the official nature of the recognition. The medal was authorized by the law and struck by the Mint as a formal act of national commemoration. But the most powerful part is what happens after the cameras are gone. Because many of the original Montford Point Marines were elderly by then, some couldn't travel, many had already died. So the recognition continued through local presentations, mailed medals, and ceremonies in which families accepted the honor on behalf of the men who never lived to hear the country applaud them. And that's the emotional spine of this. The legacy didn't survive because the nation carefully protected it. It survived because the Montford Point Marines and their advocates refused to let it be misplaced. So when you look at the association, the museum, and the medal, you're not just looking at tributes. You're looking at a second kind of battle, the fight to control the narrative after the shooting stopped. And that brings us to the final question of this series. When an institution tries to keep people at the margins, and those people prove indispensable anyway, what does that force the institution to become? By the time we reach the end of the story, it becomes clear that the Montford Point Marines didn't just join the Marine Corps. They changed what the Marine Corps could credibly say about itself. Because the institution tried to do two things at once: expand in wartime and keep its old boundaries intact. Montford Point was the compromise: separate training, segregated units, a controlled pipeline, a way to say yes without meaning welcome. But the men who came through the system did something the Marine Corps couldn't thoroughly plan for. They became Marines in the most profound, most operational sense of the word, not as a slogan, not as a public relations victory. In reality, the institution had to operate every day. And once that reality exists, it doesn't stay politely contained. The Corps could define its roles narrowly. It could try to keep the myth that some Marines were real Marines and others were something else. But war has a way of stripping that down to the only question that matters: can you do the job when it counts? And over, the answer was yes. That's what they forced the Corps to confront. You can't demand Marine standards and then claim the people who meet those standards are still outsiders. You can try, you can stall, you can bury them in separate units and separate spaces. But every time those Marines performed, every time they endured, every time they held the line the way Marines are taught to keep it, the institution's old story lost another piece of its credibility. So, what did they force the Marine Corps to become? They forced it to become more honest. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without resistance, but inevitably. They forced the Corps to accept that its identity couldn't remain a club defined by exclusion while also claiming to be the nation's elite fighting force. Because elitism built on prejudice isn't a strength, it's fragility. It's a fear of being measured alongside people you've spent generations insisting don't belong. Montford Point Marines didn't ask to be treated as an exception. They demanded to be measured by the standard. And once the Marine Corps agreed to measure them, once it put them through the system and used them in the machinery of war, it couldn't keep pretending the results didn't count. And that's the lasting power of the Montford Point. It exposes a truth about institutional change that goes far beyond the military. Institutions rarely evolve because they suddenly become brave. They grow because the people they tried to exclude become impossible to ignore. Montford Point was designed to keep Black Marines separate. Instead, it created a generation of Marines who made separation harder to justify and harder to maintain. Not through speeches, through performance, through discipline, through refusing to disappear. So when you hear Montford Point Marines, don't think first, think forced. Force the door open, yes, but also force the institution to reckon with what it had been saying about itself all along. Because once you've watched Marines earn the title under segregation and still carry the load anyway, the question isn't whether they belonged. The question is, why did the country ever pretend it didn't? Next time, we're stepping into a story that feels impossible until you realize it happened in plain sight. March 1977, Washington, D.C. A coordinated hostage siege hits 3 locations, including the district building, and suddenly the Capitol's stability is more performance than protection. Nearly 150 people are trapped inside a crisis that lasts close to 2 days, with threats that make the entire city fear a catastrophic ending. And the most surprising part, the way it ends. Not with a dramatic assault, but with negotiation, diplomacy, and a careful exit that could have gone wrong at any second. Thank you for joining us tonight in the Scarlet Tavern, where the candles burn low, the stories burn deep, and the truth is always one drink away.
And then in 1997, 7 African American soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor by President Clinton. First Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker, the 92nd Infantry Division, led in a daring assault on a German-held hill. Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter Jr., 12th Armored Division, fought despite being wounded, killing enemy troops. First Lieutenant John R. Fox, 92nd Infantry Division, ordered artillery fire on his own position to stop a major enemy attack. Private First Class Willie F. James Jr., 104th Infantry Division, killed while attempting to rescue his platoon leader. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, 761st Tank Battalion, continued to fight after his tank was hit, dying to protect his crew. Major Charles L. Thomas, 103rd Infantry Division, led a tank destroyer unit and stayed in command despite severe wounds, and Private George Watson, Quartermaster Corps, drowned after saving other soldiers from a sinking ship, and only First Lieutenant Vernon Baker was alive to receive the medal.
Yeah, you don't usually survive to get the Medal of Honor.
Yeah,
Not
it's
usually.
very rare. But we want to thank everybody for listening. And yeah, thank you for joining the Scarlet Tavern.